He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, ko William Ray tēnei. I am dropping into your feed today to bring you an episode of a podcast which I think Black Sheep listeners are going to love. So it's a series called Kelly Tarlton's Final Treasure Hunt. I've been working on producing this series alongside the host, Hamish Williams, and Ali Callahan, his producer, and a bunch of other people from RNZ. And it is an absolutely mind-blowing show. And I wish I could tell you all the stuff that makes it mind-blowing. But as I speak now, we've yet to release those most mind-blowing episodes, and I think they're going to make some news when we do release them. It is just the weirdest, most fascinating story, full of unexpected twists and turns, and it's a lot about New Zealand history too. So to give you the lowdown, Kelly Tarlton, a lot of Kiwis will probably know the name from Kelly Tarlton's Underwater World, the famous aquarium in Auckland. But it turns out, and I did not know this before we started working on this project, but Kelly Tarlton was also New Zealand's most successful underwater treasure hunter. Like, that's what he spent most of his life doing, just going down into shipwrecks, blowing them open with gelignite, using these big sort of suction dredge things to suck up sand, looking for gold and jewels, and finding quite a lot of it over the years. And he actually only founded that aquarium, Kelly Tarlton's aquarium, to fund more treasure hunting expeditions. And very sadly, Kelly died quite young in the 1980s, and at the time he died, he had one last treasure hunt incomplete. It was the hunt for the third anchor of the St. John Baptiste, and that was a ship which came to Aotearoa, New Zealand, at about the exact same time that Captain Cook was here for his first voyage. Basically, circumstances intervened and they ended up leaving 3 of their anchors on the seabed. Now, one of them, if you've ever gone to Te Papa Museum, you'll probably have seen it. If you walk in the front doors, it's that giant big anchor that hangs on the wall just to your left. It's like 4.5 meters long, weighs like 1.5 tons. It's a big, giant thing. And Kelly recovered that anchor, that one that's hanging on the wall. There was a second one which was recovered by another local Kaitaia diver, a guy called Mike Beersley. That's at the Kaitaia Museum. The third one is still sitting at the bottom of Doubtless Bay, or at least we assume it's still there. No one's seen it since Kelly saw it in the 1980s. So this podcast is all about the effort to go and recover that anchor, which would be, we think, the oldest European artefact left in New Zealand. And this is a story about adventure. It's a story about Kelly's life story, but it's also the story of how this anchor got there. And that is a crazy story all on its own. It's got everything you'd want in a Black Sheep story. There's kidnapping, there's mysterious imaginary islands, which are apparently full of Jewish people and tons of gold. There's smuggling, there's scurvy. It's got it all. So I'm going to play you this episode, which is actually the third episode of the Kelly Tarlton's Final Treasure Hunt podcast, but it is the one where we go deep on the story of the St. John Baptiste and its captain, Francois-Marie de Serval. So I'm going to hand off to Hamish Williams, host of Kelly Tarlton's Final Treasure Hunt, and you can hear that story. I hope you enjoy it, and be sure to go and follow Kelly Tarlton's Final Treasure Hunt wherever you listen to Black Sheep. You can get this the same place, or of course you can go to rnz.co.nz. Thank you very much, and I hope to be bringing you more regular Black Sheep probably sometime in the new year. So you're going to have to wait a bit longer. I'm very sorry. But in the meantime, here is this awesome story, Kelly Tarlton's Final Treasure Hunt and the Voyage of the St. John Baptiste.
Every treasure hunt needs a great backstory. The origin of how something becomes treasured is what gives it its value. Think the tomb of Tutankhamun, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Rosetta Stone, the terracotta warriors in China, even the America's Cup. None of these things are valued on the basis of what they're made from. It's the story that makes them treasures. So to understand what makes the anchors that Kelly Tarlton found treasures, I've got to go back in time to 1769. How did a Frenchman with no intention of visiting New Zealand end up leaving 3 anchors in Doubtless Bay, the very first authenticated European artefacts left in these islands? Well, it's a pretty astonishing tale. Smuggling, scurvy, kidnapping, and imaginary islands full of Jewish gold. I'm Hamish Williams, and this is Kelly Tarlton's Final Treasure Hunt. The hero, or maybe the anti-hero of our story, and please forgive my French pronunciation, is Captain Jean-François-Marie de Surville. Decorated veteran of the 7 Years' War, he'd been wounded twice in action fighting the British. Contemporary accounts describe him as a skilled sailor and navigator, a firm but fair commander, highly intelligent and humane. That's one version of him. Some members of Ngāti Kahu, the local iwi in Doubtless Bay, describe him differently.
That punk. That punk that stole our tupuna. Obviously, a long time ago, but it's still fresh in our minds that an ancestor was taken at our first meeting. So it didn't start off very good.
We'll get to all that later on, I promise. But for now, let's go to where this expedition gets started. The French colony of Pont-de-Chéry in southeast India, known at the time as the French Riviera of the East.
The origins of this voyage, of this expedition, were deeply mysterious.
Mike Lee is an Auckland councillor. When he's not doing his civic duty, he's a historian specialising in French exploration of the South Pacific. His book is Navigators and Naturalists, French Exploration of New Zealand in the South Seas, 1769 to 1824.
The people who organised the expedition were business people and high officials in the French East India Company, which was a rival to the famous British East India Company.
De Surville wasn't like Captain Cook, an official representative of the state, in this case, France. De Surville was a private businessman. After the 7 Years' War, he'd got together with some fellow French businessmen and come up with a scheme to sail a trading ship named the Saint Jean-Baptiste into the Pacific Ocean.
Perhaps I should describe the ship Saint Jean-Baptiste. It was a relatively big ship, 600 tons. It was also armed, an armed merchantman.
This ship was massive. It was built to be ready for war at the drop of a hat. Armed with 36 cannons, it was 650 tons and housed around 200 crew. Just to give a comparison, Captain Cook's ship, the Endeavour, was only about 360 tons and carried about half as many crew.
So it was a big ship, and it was carrying a luxury cargo.
We're talking about fancy carpets from Constantinople, bottles of expensive brandy, port and whiskey, bolts of dyed silk, and a whole bunch of opium to keep the party going. The ship, in short, was packed to the gunnels with treasure. You might be wondering, why would anyone take all the stuff on a voyage of discovery to New Zealand? Well, here's the thing. De Surville never intended to go to New Zealand. His plan was to sail for South America and sell his trade goods for Spanish silver.
And then back to India with massive profits.
Which begs another question. Why would De Surville sail all the way across the Pacific to South America instead of taking the shorter, easier route across the Atlantic?
The ultimate goal was also highly illegal.
De Surville was essentially a smuggler. He was hoping to dodge the Spanish Navy, which patrolled the Atlantic, enforcing a trade embargo on its colonies in the New World. The risks for running that blockade were enormous.
Just as an example how seriously they took these rules, an English captain had his ear cut off as punishment for being caught, in essence, smuggling, which set off a war between Great Britain and Spain. It was called the War of Jenkins' Ear.
De Surville's crew knew nothing about any of this. What they thought was going on was they were chasing down the Pacific version of El Dorado, and that is an entirely weird story on its own.
The rumours were going around that the English had found a marvellous new island in the middle of the Pacific. The rumours of this wondrous island got back to French India, but somehow it had a spin on it.
Here's how a Frenchman who was there at the time reported it.
The rumour spread that an English vessel had found in the South Sea a very rich island where, among other peculiarities, a colony of Jews had been settled. The account of this discovery became so well known that it was believed in India that the purpose of the Surville's voyage was to search for this marvellous island.
This rumour got its start from the British sailors who'd landed at Tahiti in 1767.
When Wallace's ship, the Dolphin, was sailing from Tahiti, they saw a sailing waka or sailing vessel which looked to this chap like a crewed by Jewish people. And so that was spun out of all proportions.
By the time it reached French ears, Tahiti had been transformed into Davis Land. This was like the Pacific version of El Dorado, the mythical golden city Spanish conquistadors believed existed somewhere in South America. Davis Land was supposed to be full of gold and, for some reason, Jewish people. As we've said, the real purpose of de Surville's voyage was smuggling. But he figured if he did happen to find this island, surely the locals would be interested in trading their gold for some of his luxurious silk and brandy and opium. Plus, it gave a good excuse to his crew for why they were sailing out into the Pacific. So anyway, de Surville and his ship, full of treasures, left Pondicherry and sailed off searching for Jewish gold, or at the very least, Spanish silver. He sailed out from Pondicherry, past the Philippines, Indonesia and New Guinea, headed for the Pacific. De Surville was taking a huge gamble. The seas he was sailing were poorly known to Europeans. The few charts available were often unreliable because in those days there was no accurate way to calculate longitude. Landing to resupply food and water was dangerous. In the Solomon Islands, de Surville's crew got into a bloody skirmish with indigenous people. De Surville's second-in-command, Guillaume L'Abbe, was right in the middle of it.
I saw upwards of 250 natives coming out of the forest. They ran at us like tigers. I was left alone, fighting this multitude of savages. I would have been overwhelmed if I had not noticed that their chief was standing some distance from the combatants and raising his hands to heaven and striking his chest and then raising his voice while looking towards his people, which must surely have encouraged them. This made me decide to fire a musket toward him and kill him.
By the end of the skirmish, several sailors were injured, including L'Abbe, and one dead. Around 30 Solomon Islanders were killed. De Surville knew very little about the people who lived in the places he was visiting. But he, and Europeans in general really, had a method to fix that problem. Kidnapping. The idea was to seize indigenous people and take them back to France, teach them French, then use them as translators for future efforts at trade and colonisation. By the time they sailed out into the Tasman Sea, de Surville had already kidnapped 4 people, 3 Filipinos and 1 Solomon Islander. But just a few months out of port, even before this battle in the Solomon Islands, things had started to go catastrophically wrong. Reading the journals of de Surville and Larbe, you get increasing mentions of a malady that terrified sailors. It claimed its first life on Thursday the 19th of October 1769, a 24-year-old Indian sailor named Fakira. Many, many more would follow.
Friday, December 1st, 1769. Scurvy continues and is working increasing havoc among the crew, who are becoming more and more desperate when they see no one becoming cured of this sickness. They are losing courage. I do not know what will become of us.
Scurvy is a horrific disease. It causes your gums to recede, your teeth to fall out, you vomit uncontrollably, and eventually you die. As the ship sailed further into the Pacific, the situation only got worse.
I visit the sick daily. I suffer to see the poor wretches in such a deplorable condition. I deny myself the little delicacies I took at Pondichéry for my own use. Sugar, syrup, lime juice, tea, coffee, jam. I distribute them to alleviate their pain.
The tragic irony is that one of those little delicacies Larbe was giving to his crew was actually the cure. Famously, Captain James Cook proved the British theory that scurvy could be prevented by drinking lime juice, but that fact was a closely guarded military secret. Larbe had no way of knowing this juice, rich in vitamin C, was exactly what his men needed. Without that knowledge, the sailors were dropping like flies. Larbe recorded each death in his journal next to a carefully drawn Maltese cross.
Julian Hervé, Fakir Maman, Jean Philantre, Nicolas Soleiman.
De Surville could feel his great gamble slipping towards disaster.
Sickness and death, which appear indistinguishable among the crew, have caused me to reflect seriously to see if I could not find a solution more certain than that of following the course I planned from the start.
De Surville turned to his ship's library and pulled out a copy of a map drawn 127 years earlier by a Dutch explorer named Abel Tasman. On this map was a small squiggle of land, the eastern shore of a land Tasman had dubbed New Zealand. For the crew of the Baptiste, that squiggle meant salvation, but getting to it was a horrific ordeal. As one crewman wrote,
When maneuvers are necessary, one hears terrible cries and moans. This one cries, "Oh, my arm!" Another, "Oh, my stomach," my chest, and so on.
pretty much every day a body was sewn in sailcloth, weighed down with cannonballs, and dumped over the side. The list in Larbe's journal grew longer and longer.
Georges Loreu, Michael Esson, Jean-Jacques Navet, François Alain.
De Surville began to despair. In one entry, he noted ruefully that according to his calculations, he should be 600 kilometres inside New Zealand, but all he could see was the open ocean. Then, on December 12th, 1769, the shout went up from a man aloft in the rigging.
We suddenly sighted New Zealand to the east. The horizon was very misty, which was why we took so long to see it and why we did not see more of it. The land is very high, and parts of it by the sea are sand dunes.
De Surville had arrived off the coast of Hokianga on the west coast of Northland. The St. Jean-Baptiste, though, was too large to find a safe anchorage there, so they turned north. De Surville sailed up around the tip of Cape Reinga, then south down the east coast of Northland until he reached a place known to Māori as Tokero. De Surville named the place Lauriston Bay in honour of one of the major investors in his smuggling scheme, but funnily enough, another European had already given a name to that stretch of coast, Doubtless Bay. In an astonishing coincidence, the St John Baptiste had arrived in Aotearoa, New Zealand, just as Captain Cook's Endeavour was departing these islands. You'll sometimes hear people say the ships passed so close they might have been able to see each other if they'd had men aloft. That's not really true. The ships were never that close, but it's still astonishing. No European had reached Aotearoa in more than 120 years. Now, 2 ships had turned up within weeks of each other. It must have been even more astonishing for the local Māori of Ngāti Kahu, who almost certainly heard news of the Endeavour by the time De Surville showed up. There would have been stories of a large ship full of pale-skinned strangers who had attacked and wounded several people down in the Bay of Islands using mysterious weapons which exploded with fire and smoke. Now, a far larger vessel had arrived right on Ngāti Kahu's doorstep. You've got to imagine there must have been some nerves. For their part, the sailors on the Jean Baptiste were similarly nervous. Many of the crew were on death's door. They desperately needed to put ashore, tend to their sick, and restock their supplies. But De Surville had read Abel Tasman's account of how his first contact with Māori had ended in violence. 4 Dutch sailors clubbed to death, and 1 Māori killed with musket fire. A waka paddled out to the Jean Baptiste. The men on the 2 vessels stared at one another. Here's how Mike Lee describes it in his book, Navigators and Naturalists.
The standoff lasted for some time. Then, in a wordless gesture that broke the tension, one of the men in the waka thrust aloft in each hand freshly caught fish. This immediately raised a cheer from the St. Jean Baptiste, the crew of which responded by brandishing lengths of coloured cloth, calling and beckoning. The canoe cautiously approached. It came alongside at the stern of the ship, and trading immediately got underway from the gallery windows. The men of the St. Jean Baptiste, eager for fresh food, paid for the fish with lengths of blue and white calico, which the fishermen happily draped about their shoulders, sporting them like capes.
The next day, 19th of December 1769, the crew of the Jean Baptiste were welcomed ashore. Here's how one of the ship's officers, Potier L'Homme, described it.
All the people were scattered here and there on the hills and the shore, and no doubt were doing honour to the new arrivals by waving things constantly to one side, as though to create a breeze. Some had long-haired skin cloaks, others bunches of grass. This ceremony must have been tiring for them, considering its length, because it started right from when they first saw the boat and went on until the captain set foot on land.
This is the first ever written record of voyages from Europe receiving a porphyry. And as strange as this meeting must have been for the French, it was even stranger for Māori. The crew of the Jean Baptiste were multinational. As well as white Frenchmen, there were Africans, Madagascans, Indians, Filipinos, Solomon Islanders. Many of them were clearly desperately sick. Rake thin, covered in sores, their gums receding from their teeth, cringing in pain and trembling uncontrollably. To Māori, it must have seemed like they were welcoming some strange horde of zombies.
I remember there was a corridor written by Matthews, the missionary, and he was talking about one of my ancestors out in Whatuwhiwhi, talking about that time of De Surville. This old tohunga described them as waraki, or sea goblins.
It's a story that's been passed down through the generations among the iwi of Doubtless Bay.
Ka rere mai te waka tūpuna ko te māmaru me ona rangatira, ko te parata ara ko te kahutia nui. Tū haka hi te tupuna o maunga tani whairunga i te whenua, me ona tāngata o ngā tikahu iwi. No reira kia kōtora o te haukainga, o loto whatuwhiwhi. He raru i te maru o tērā o tō tātou whare tupuna heiti tau marangai, tēnā kōta. Pērā no i ngā mihi whānui tia i a tātou anō, i ngā uri mokapuna o tērā o tō tātou tupuna heiti tau marangai, e horarai runga i te matu o te whenua. No reira huri noa tēnā kōta katoa. My name is Tipene Paul, and I am a descendant of Haiti Tau Marangai and a member of Te Whānau Moana and Te Roro Huri, the two hapu that reside in Whatuwhiwhi.
Whatuwhiwhi is a small town at the northern tip of Doubtless Bay. It overlooks the small cove where De Surville and his crew first landed.
They were in dire straits, and fortunately for them, they were shown hospitality on the part of the people that lived on the peninsula in Whatuwhiwhi at that time, and helped nurse many of those men back to health. Not all recovered, but a number did.
Taiga Tukareri also has a whakapapa link to the landing of the St John Baptiste. He's a descendant of a rangatira named Ranginui, one of the first chiefs to meet De Surville and his officers.
I'm from a little place called Kenana, Koimaru in Mangonui. We come from the Waka Mamaru, and Parata was the Kaihautu, and Kahutia Nui. This is the tupuna whaia that we all come from on this side of Ngāti Kahu. And our hapu is Matarahurahu. It's a hapu of Ngāpui, Honeheke, Pōkai, his hapu, and Ngāti Kahu.
Where are we today, Taiga?
We're at a beach called Pātia. The marae over here is Haiti Tau Marangai, whare tupuna.
The significance of this being is this is the beach where De Surville and the sailors of the St John Baptiste came to land.
This is where they came up, and a lot of sick guys, scurvy, and sick and dying. And apparently Te Ranginui was one of those sort of tupuna first time to see these people and touch base with the Europeans. And we sort of take it that he was a very hospitable, as they did. Our people were very friendly, and he took them in and brought them back to good health.
Well, most of them, but not all.
A whole lot of them passed away, died here, and he buried them along these sand dunes here.
Just the sand dunes behind us.
Yeah, just
right here.
Just here and all along here, they say.
So all along here, we've still got the bodies of the sailors from the St John Baptiste.
Yeah, and that's listening to some of the locals coming here to the marae for wānanga. Other times when people have been playing around here, all the bones or skulls will fall out. And the tikanga for this hapu is they get some kaumātua and they come and bless it and put it back and have a kraki over it.
Even all these years later, when they find it, they're still caring for those sailors that came from the other side of the world.
Yeah, that's right. It's that manaakitanga, I guess, to look after and respect the bones despite the events after that.
Well, some written accounts suggest a degree of appreciation for the manaakitanga of Ngāti Kahu. Pretty much every journal entry contains a disparaging reference towards Māori. They were described, inevitably in the language of the day, as savages. Here's a typical example from Portier L'Homme.
They have shy natures, but they are lazy to the last degree. Treacherous, thieving, defiant, and on the lookout to surprise you without thinking twice.
De Surville committed a few cultural faux pas in his time on shore, including touching the head of a rangatira, a serious breach of tapu. They also threw their dead into the water of the bay, another serious offence. However, Māori were tolerant of these transgressions. They continued to trade with the new arrivals. They sent out waka filled with fish, as well as vitamin-rich wild celery and watercress, exactly what the crew needed to recover from scurvy. They also allowed de Surville to refill the ship's stock of firewood and fresh water. Some of the Jean-Baptiste officers, especially L'Abbé, had argued they should simply take all these things from Māori at the point of a musket. But de Surville refused. In exchange, de Surville gave metal tools, bolts of cloth, along with live pigs and chickens. The French celebrated Christmas on these shores, the first mass ever held in Aotearoa. All in all, contact was wary but peaceful, especially compared to James Cook's more violent interactions in the weeks earlier. Then, on December 28th, it all went wrong. De Surville and many of his crew were ashore when they saw the horizon begin to darken. A storm was brewing. De Surville ordered his men to the boats. They rowed desperately for their ship as the waves grew and began crashing around them. One boat, crewed by men still badly sick, too weak to row in the heavy surf, was forced to turn back for shore. They landed on the beach, soaked and shivering. A local rangatira, a man named Rangi Nui, saw their suffering and came down to help. Here's how Tartlon recorded what happened.
I was very agreeably surprised when a sort of chief among the savages came up to me with some dried fish, which he got another savage to bring me. When I received him, I indicated I had nothing to give him in exchange. He made signs to say he asked for nothing, and in addition offered his hut to house us all. This offer appeared to proceed from a heart truly humane and touched by the accident which had prevented our returning to the ship. But I judged it unwise to trust him.
Meanwhile, de Surville and the others reached the Jean-Baptiste and scrambled aboard. The winds were howling, and de Surville noticed, to his horror, the anchor was beginning to drag across the bottom. His ship was drifting inch by inch towards the rugged cliffs of the Karikari Peninsula. The ship's yawl, a boat used to ferry men and cargo from the ship to shore, broke loose and vanished into the storm. De Surville gave orders to drop a second anchor, then a third. The ship held in place for a few hours. The crew drew an uneasy sign of relief. Then, one of the anchor ropes snapped. Immediately, the ship began moving again, drifting closer and closer to the rocks. De Surville and his crew were moments from disaster. There was a fourth and final anchor he could try, but if that failed, all would be lost. He set his jaw and gave his orders. Cut the lines to the remaining two anchors, unfurl the sails, and try to make a break for open ocean. De Surville's second-in-command, L'Abbé, nodded, then relayed his orders to the exhausted crew.
The sea was breaking over us and driving us onto the coast. To make matters worse, the vessel stayed for quite a long time without answering her rudder, and we stared death in the face, seeing rocks along the length of the ship fit to make your hair stand on end.
Finally, the ship began to turn.
God has delivered us from danger and worked a miracle in our favor.
The next morning, de Surville took stock of the situation. 3 anchors were lost at the bottom of the ocean, and the yawl had also vanished. De Surville had an anchor to spare, but the loss of the yawl was potentially catastrophic. Remember, the Jean-Baptiste was a big ship, 650 tonnes, bigger than many super yachts you'd see today. It needed that yawl to ferry water, crew and supplies back and forth from the shore. If you're thinking of the Jean-Baptiste like a spaceship, the yawl was like the lunar lander. But as he trained his telescope towards shore, L'Abbe felt an enormous wave of relief. Mike Lee tells the story.
L'Abbe was scanning the shore with his telescope, with his spyglass, and suddenly, high up on the beach, lo and behold, was the yawl. And of course, he immediately told the captain, and the captain himself said, "I'm going to the rescue." So he ordered up a longboat with the crew and headed ashore as quickly as he could. But much to his frustration and then his anger, the yawl that he saw sitting on the beach, almost within reach, something which could change the whole outcome of the expedition, suddenly disappeared. And it seemed that the local people had hauled it over the sandhills and into one of those impounded lakes behind the beach at Doubtless Bay.
To de Surville, this looked like theft. But as Tipani Paul explains, according to Māori custom, anything which was washed up on your beach was essentially your property.
De Surville and his people would have had no understanding of any sort of tikanga or rules that were in place, or the Māori worldview in relation to things like that boat washing up on the shore. As far as they were concerned, I'm certain it would have been, well, that's ours. And then, of course, the French wanted to take it back.
Surville, the diplomat, the patient man who frustrated lieutenants by being so placatory and they thought overly friendly, if you like, to the chief. In a word, lost it. He went up and down the beach and ordered his men to set fire to the huts that were there, set houses on fire, confiscated a beautiful waka.
A rangatira came down to the beach, presumably trying to reason with de Surville.
He had a row or a leaf in each hand, a sign of peace.
But de Surville wasn't having it. He had this man seized, tied him up, and carried him away to the St. Jean-Baptiste.
Captured a chief, not the leading chief, but nonetheless a rangatira, had him bound and taken back to the ship. The captive was called Ranginui.
And if that name is sounding familiar to you all listening, it's because this man, Ranginui, was the very same rangatira who'd offered food and shelter to Poutier and his men the previous night. When he was brought on board, Poutier and Ranginui locked eyes with each other.
Recognizing me and not knowing what his fate would be, he flung himself at my knees, embraced them fervently, with tears in his eyes. He said some incomprehensible things to me, but indicated by signs that he was the one who had brought fish to me. I did my best to console him and explain we had no wish whatsoever to harm him. It was useless. He kept on crying, especially when he had irons put on his ankles to make him prisoner.
For all the sympathy, many of the ship's officers, including L'Abbe, complained that de Surville should have actually kidnapped more Māori.
To my mind, Mr. Surville was wrong in not carrying away a dozen natives. They would have been useful on board for working the lower sails, as we already lost 60 men from the crew, in addition to 40 who are still sick.
I think they always had an intention to take somebody, because they'd done that in the islands in the Malacca Straits and up in Southeast Asia prior to that. I think it was about, looking to bring those people back as almost as trophies in a way.
So this was all rather tragic. No lives were lost or bloods were shed, but it was an act of violence and cruelty that people to this day remember.
Tiger is one of those people who remembers. He's a direct descendant of Ranginui. The wharenui of his marae, which overlooks Doubtless Bay, is named after his kidnapped tupuna.
We heard that over in Peru, Chile, he was sick and died of starvation. Well, we heard that the water was pedo.
Pedo, by the way, means rotten or spoiled.
They say it was pedo and that he wouldn't drink or eat. He died of starvation and the Serval threw him overboard. What we heard.
I told Tiger that the journals of the St John Baptiste, written by de Serval and Labe, suggested that Ranginui was treated with some respect. They say he was invited for meals at the captain's table and always served first. According to Labe, after a few days of sailing, Ranginui was released from irons and seemed to regain his spirits.
He no longer seems sad. He laughs with everybody, drinks and eats well and sleeps well.
However, the journals also record that after the Jean-Baptiste sailed away from Doubtless Bay, scurvy hit the crew once more. By the time it approached the coast of South America, a further 40 men were dead of disease, thirst and starvation. Among them was Ranginui. Mike Lee puts it like this in his book, Navigators and Naturalists.
The water supplies, so laboriously replenished, cask by cask, in Doubtless Bay, had almost run out. Ranginui began to show the first signs of scurvy. Serval tried to sustain him with a share of his own ration of food and water. But the Māori physically weakened and depressed in spirits, knowing that he was further from home with every sea mile, began to fade.
On the 24th of March 1770, one of the ship's officers, Pierre-Antoine Monneron, recorded that Ranginui had died.
Without doubt, grief contributed greatly to his death. But the shortage of water, which we had been suffering for a long time, was the principal cause of it.
So a pretty sad ending for that rangatira who was the chief of that place at that time. In terms of how the rest of the people at home or other descendants of Te Whānau Moana and Te Rorohuri, what they think about that now, I'm not sure. I know some of them really, who are aware, get upset about it, despite the fact that it's a long time ago now. It wasn't a good first interaction. And I think there is residual bitterness, maybe, a bit of anger too.
At long last, on the 8th of April 1770, the St John Baptiste reached South America. But de Serval himself never set foot on shore. He commanded a ship's boat trying to sail close enough to a beach that a man could swim ashore. But then a huge swell came up behind them. The boat was caught by the wave, capsized, and de Serval vanished beneath the water. The rest of his crew eventually made landfall. They were arrested and their ship impounded by Spanish authorities. It was years before the survivors returned home to France. De Serval's great gamble had been a disaster. Out of a crew of 194 that originally left Pont-de-Chéry, 103 were now dead. And that luxury cargo, none of it turned a profit. The ship's insurers would eventually auction it off. The legacy of de Serval's visit has endured in the memories of Ngāti Kahu. A few years later, when another French sailor, Marion de Freyne, turned up, he and his crew were massacred at Spirits Bay by tangata whenua. Maybe they'd heard about what happened with de Serval, but we don't really know. More recently, a monument raised to de Serval on Karikari Peninsula disappeared. Maybe understandably, locals saw nothing to celebrate about the man who'd kidnapped their tupuna.
And I remember my father saying to me once, I don't know why you'd be looking to commemorate that. I had the feeling there was a level of disdain for that whole affair.
Today, the only physical legacy of the St. John Baptiste is the bones of the sailors left in the sand dunes and the 3 large anchors which sat at the bottom of the sea for more than 200 years. That is, until Kelly Tarlton came along. One of these anchors, the first Kelly found, now hangs in the foyer of Te Papa National Museum in Wellington, with hundreds of people walking beneath it every day. You can see it for yourself. Just walk in the doors and look up to your left. When I walked into the foyer and stared up at it, I had a museum staff member jokingly remark, "Oh, you're looking at that bit of old French junk." The museum curator was a little more diplomatic.
My name's Katie Cooper, curator New Zealand Histories and Cultures at Te Papa.
How much work goes into getting an artefact like this from the bottom of Doubtless Bay to hanging in the foyer of Te Papa Wellington?
Yes, well, it's no small thing. As you can see, it is a large anchor. It's something like 1,400 kilograms, 4.5 metres long. So, the recovery was a sort of mammoth effort. In 1974, Kelly Tarlton, the famed diver, found the first anchor, and then shortly after that, a Northland diver named Mike Beasley found the second, and then the government offered $5,000 to this effort of recovering these very precious and unique artefacts from New Zealand's history. The Kaitaia community really rallied behind them, and so they raised, people donated cranes, and then they spent a year conserving these anchors, and then from there they had to get them, as you say, from Northland to Wellington. It's a mission, but we've had it on the foyer, on the wall of the foyer here since Te Papa opened.
What makes it so important to have it in our foyer of Te Papa? What do you have to do to be so prominent?
Well, I think it is both of those things. There's this really fantastic story of the recovery and the conservation of these items by by locals and by Tarleton. So I think that is a really interesting story, and I think when you see it you get a sense of just what an achievement that was, because it is such an imposing object. But as you say, it is also, there's a painful history there. It is implicated in some of the very earliest interactions between Māori and Europeans. I think it's really significant from that point of view as well. It marks a real shift in the relationship between Europe and the Pacific, and Europe and New Zealand.
There's a third anchor still sitting down on the bottom of Doubtless Bay, and we're hoping to go and see if we can find it. Is there room on the wall for a third anchor?
Well, it is a big wall, but it's also a big anchor.
And this is the weird thing. That anchor is really, really big. You heard Dr. Cooper. It's 1,400 kilos, 4.5 metres long. The one that's still at the bottom of Doubtless Bay is the exact same size. So how come? It's been over 40 years and literally nobody since Kelly Tarlton has managed to find it. I've got exactly zero experience with treasure hunting, and I'm not even that keen on diving. But I do know where I could get some help. There's a whole bunch of Kelly's old crew still around New Zealand, and I'm willing to bet they might be keen to help out on Kelly Tarlton's final treasure hunt. Coming up next time.
He's got a manhole in the footpath lifted up, and he said, poke your head down there, you see. And so we sort of climbed down the ladder a bit, and it's just a big dark hole. And he said, look, we think we could put an aquarium down here. And I thought, you've got to be joking.
Thanks for listening to Kelly Tarlton's Final Treasure Hunt. If you like the show, be sure to follow us on your favourite podcasting app. And if you want to help more people find the show, please leave us a review. Kelly Tarlton's Final Treasure Hunt is written and presented by me, Hamish Williams. Our producers are Ali Callahan, William Ray, Phil Vine and Justin Gregory. Our sound engineers are William Saunders, Phil Benge and Mark Chesterman. Our production coordinator is Brianna Uritich and the executive producer is Tim Watkin. Special thanks to the Tartlon family for their support and trust in making this podcast. There is so much more to the life of Kelly Tarlton. There are some great books on his life available. We've made some recommendations on the show's webpage. You can find that at rnz.co.nz/podcasts.